we are now able to get a list of all the different campaigns that have been deployed through our factory. This information is currently appearing on our console, and we definitely want to get it on the screen. So in this video, we're going to figure out how to take this data and use it inside of our React component to get it to show up. At present, we're doing that request or that call to get deployed campaigns inside of the component did mount method. Now in any traditional or kind of typical React project, doing our data fetching inside of component did mount is 100% appropriate. So what we're doing right here, totally appropriate in a traditional React application. However, we are making use of Next.js, which introduces one little extra requirement around data loading. You see, in the last video, we explained server-side rendering and what it does for us. We had said that server-side rendering attempts to render our component on the server and then take all that HTML and send it down to the browser. The catch there is that if we want to do our data fetching, like if we want to do this step right here, where we have our next application reach out to the Ethereum network to get some initial data, unfortunately, Next does not execute that component did mount method on the server. So in other words, when our application is being rendered by Next on the server, this code right here, not executed, not one line of it. So if we want to make sure that this data fetching process right here occurs on the server, we have to move it to a slightly different method inside of our component. This method is called GetInitialProps. It is a lifecycle method that is defined exclusively and used exclusively by Next.js. So GetInitialProps is not used in traditional React. It is something very specific to Next.js. Let's take a look at a diagram to figure out exactly how it works. All right, so right over here. So let's imagine that some browser tries to visit the root route of our application. Next is going to boot up and it's going to say, oh, okay, we need to show the campaign index component. The Next server is going to look at that component and it's going to find the GetInitialProps function tied to it. Next is going to execute just that function. So it's not going to attempt to render the component yet. It's going to just render this function right here. After calling that function, we're going to return some initial data. So this will be any data we care about. It could be our list of campaigns. It can be the number of contributors on an individual campaign, whatever we want it to be. Next, we'll then take this initial data right here and provide it to the actual campaign index component as props on the server. This component will be rendered on the server. Next, we'll then take that component's HTML that is produced and send that down to our browser. So in other words, if we want to make use of the server-side rendering stuff, we have to do our initial data loading inside of this GetInitialProps function. So let's define this function. We're going to do our data loading or our data call over to our factory contract inside there, and then we will be able to make use of that initial data inside of our campaign index component. All right, so back over here, we're going to first start off by defining the GetInitialProps function. Now there's one little twist here, one thing that kind of makes life a little bit more interesting. When we define this, we're going to use one additional keyword when we define the function. We're going to say static GetInitialProps, like so. Using this keyword right here of static defines a class function. So normally, whenever we use a class in JavaScript, we have to create an instance of that class to access any of the methods tied to it. For example, if I wanted to directly call the render method, I would have to say something like const campaign index is new campaign index. And then I could call on this little instance right here, campaign index.render. With a static keyword, this function is not assigned to instances of the class. Instead, the function is assigned to the class itself. So if we wanted to directly call GetInitialProps right here, we would say campaign index.getInitialProps, like so. We do not have to create an instance. Now you might be just a little bit curious why Next requires that. So this is a requirement placed on us by Next. Well, it's very simple and very straightforward. Next wants to be able to retrieve this initial data without attempting to actually render our component. Rendering a component is a very computationally expensive process. So by skipping any initial rendering here and just directly calling that function, Next is able to make the entire server-side rendering process much more efficient. So that's why we are using that static keyword. Now, in addition to the static keyword, we are going to write some asynchronous code inside of here as well. So we're also going to put async on there too. All right, so now we can take the call to get our list of campaigns that we are doing inside of component.mount. I'm going to cut this line of code and I'm going to put it inside of GetInitialProps. And then from GetInitialProps, I'm going to return an object. And that object is going to be provided to our component as props. So right here, I'm going to say simply return campaigns is going to be campaigns. And once again, ES 2015 code, we can condense this down to be simply campaigns. Last thing we need to do is delete the old component.mount. All right, now that's a fun refactor if you ask me. So now, whenever our component is rendered, GetInitialProps is called, we fetch our list of campaigns, we return the object. This object is provided to our component as props, and now inside of our component, we can freely reference this.props.campaigns. So for example, let's take our div right here, and we will replace the text with the address inside of this campaigns array. So to access that thing, we're going to place our curly braces and then say this.props.campaigns. Again, we have access to the campaigns property right here because we returned a property on this object called campaigns. That's going to be our array of addresses, and I want to print out the very first element inside there. So I'm going to say, just give me the first address because there's only one. All right, let's save this file and flip back over to the browser and see how we are doing. All right, so back over inside the browser, I'm going to entirely refresh the page. And sure enough, our address appears on the screen. Now, one thing you might find really interesting to test the server-side rendering aspect of this, because this component is rendered both on the server and once everything loads up, it's executed on the client as well. So we can test exclusively the server-side rendering aspect of this by disabling JavaScript execution inside our browser. So that's going to keep the React app from loading up in our browser, and we can confirm that Next is successfully fetching this list of campaigns. We can do that by clicking on the little I right here, and then where you see JavaScript, we can change that to always block on this site. So now JavaScript is not being executed on this page, and if we refresh the page, you'll see that the address is still going to appear on the screen. So here it is, here's the address, and that's because our server executed the call to our contract to fetch this address right here. That's really great news, because that means that if someone on a very slow mobile device or someone without MetaMask or who knows what type of situation tries to access our page, they're still going to see some content appear on the screen, which is exactly what we want to make sure of. All right, so this is definitely working out pretty well. The last thing I'm going to do is make sure that I re-enable JavaScript. So I'm going to click on that I again. I'll find JavaScript and I'll change it to use global default. And then once again, I'll refresh the page just to enact that change. Okay, in the last couple of videos, we have learned a lot. And as I've said at the start of this section, we're kind of diverging away from Ethereum a little bit. I can't say it enough, however. All this stuff is so incredibly interconnected. And if you want to build a quality Ethereum app, you have to do stuff like the server-side rendering stuff that we're doing. It's just comes with the territory. It's a part of the ecosystem. Hopefully it's not that bad. Maybe you're really enjoying this and I'm just thinking that you might not be enjoying it. I don't know. Anyways, I think our application is turning out pretty well so far. This might all seem a little bit complicated, but honestly, at this point, we have covered like 90% of everything that we really need to know about React and everything we need to know about Next. So essentially from here on out, we're just going to be doing the same thing over and over and over, getting some initial data inside the GetInitialProps function, and then printing that out on the screen somehow. So pretty much the same thing from here on out. So we'll get a lot of practice with both React and Next and Ethereum, of course. Let's take a pause right here. We'll continue in the next video and continue working on our application.